Morning, everyone. Let's hear good morning or afternoon, wherever you are in the chat. Let us know you're out there. We are here for our final webinar of this series, focusing today on information data management. My name is Harmony. My ancestral name is Setlakas, and I'm from the Tla'amin Nation here in British Columbia. Can we go to the next slide, Allison, please? I cannot believe we're already at the sixth one. In some ways it's like super long, in some ways it's really short. I can't tell time during COVID anymore. Anyway, I'm hoping folks have been here. I'm seeing lots of familiar names in the chat. Let us know if this is your first webinar or if you're on our continuing journey with us. So this series is organized by a collaborative of self-governing Indigenous governments across the country to provide some practical capacity bridging and development content about data to support your governments in your responsibilities. It's accompanied by a toolkit that has, I think, a wealth of things for you to draw on throughout the series and afterwards, and a series of advisors to help coach you and walk you through your particular context. So we started at a very, very macro level, and we've been kind of moving more and more into practical territory with our content as the webinars have unfolded. So we started at session 1 with introduction to who's who, what are we doing here, introduction to the toolkit. We heard from Gwen Phillips on the 20-year journey that Tunaka have been on in aligning vision with data and indicators and performance measurement. Webinar 2, we dug into the self-assessment tool, which is really a bit of a centerpiece tool of the toolkit from which you can kind of figure out where your government is at relative to all of the things we're talking about in this series, and then be able to draw on the specific tools that are useful for you in your context and against your own priorities. In session 2, we also talked about change management, bringing people along with the change, because we know if people are resisting it or if they don't understand it, then you'll be kind of working on your own to try to make change happen. Session 3, we talked about data governance. So what are the structures you need to set up within your government to manage and make decisions about data? We talked about the unique history of data relative to us as Indigenous peoples and why data sovereignty and data governance is so important to us. And we talked about how to go about accessing data about your citizens that may reside in different places outside of your government. Session 4, we heard from our friends at CIHI, who talked us through life cycles of indicators and how do you go about designing, tracking, monitoring indicators that matter to you and your government's strategic plan. And then in the last session, we talked about collecting data. So Big River Analytics talked us through a very realistic picture of the very necessary work that comes along with collecting data. They advised us to draw on existing and secondary data first, administrative data, which Bobby and Stuart today are going to talk us a little bit more through. They also talked about StatsCan data and some tools, tricks, tips on how to access that. They also talked us through primary data collection via surveys, including the very necessary upfront investment in pre-planning work. So today is the last one of this first series. We're going to talk about the management of data today. Bobby and Stuart will kick us off talking about records management. Big River will be back again today to talk us through some content on data quality, privacy, security, and the relevant tools in the toolkit. So today's quite jam-packed, so I'm going to just do quick housekeeping for a couple of slides here. I'm going to skip the definitions and the self-assessment recap today, and our presenters will cover that content in their time with us. Next slide, please. So we are recording this webinar. However, you will not be recorded today. If you would like to turn on your video, please feel free to do so. It makes it a bit more fun for us as presenters. To ask questions, feel free to chime in through the chat or use the hand up function. I'm not talking much today, so I'm not going to bother covering the personal notes. Next slide. I think we all know this by now. All I think I would say is that, you know, apart from the content that's already on the slide, if you go to the top right-hand corner, there's a little button called View. You can choose different ways in which you're viewing the screen. Side-by-side speaker will show just the people that are presenting. Side-by-side gallery will show everyone who's got their cameras on. Next slide. And with that, I'm handing it over to our friends Stuart and Bobby, who are also advisors in with this project, and they will introduce themselves and present on information governance records management. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Bobby and I want to acknowledge that we are in BC, located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coquitlam peoples. Today, we're going to cover 5 topics: standards and best practices, profiling, information form of governance, which we'll refer to as IG, records and information forms management, which we'll call RIM, and we'll be asking you a question in the chat on that, and admin data. Our understanding is that each SGIG is at a different stage of their maturity regarding data forms of governments and RIM, and that some SGIGs have RIM and programs and others don't. Our intention in our webinar today is to paint a picture for you of what can be and what is being achieved by SGIGs across the country.
So today, Stuart and I have a lot of experience with records and information management. And we have been working with, as Harmony said before, we are expert advisors for this project, and we are also working with ARMA International, which is the Professional Association for Records Management, and the First Nations Public Sector Service Secretariat with their Management Training Academy's Curriculum Advisory Committee for Records Management Content for Indigenous governments in Canada.
On this slide, we ask, what are standards? What are best practices? Why use standards and best practices? And on the Data Governance Toolkit website, there's a web page that is currently under development where you will be able to get downloadable documents that provide you with a list of best practices and standards. On this slide, you see at the bottom in orange, a link to ARMA, which has a good set of standards and best practices that you may wish to review. As the slide shows, a standard is an agreed to, proven best way of doing something that's accepted by a business sector that also applies the wisdom and experience of experts. A best practice is a commercial or professional method, technique, or procedure accepted or prescribed as being most effective. Best practices identify and use applicable standards. The slide also shows some standard producing organizations on the top right. The International Organization for Standardization, also known as ISO, and the Canadian General Standards Board's CGSB. Now, to date, there is no data governance standard, but there are lots of records management and information standards. On the bottom right of the slide, it also shows you some of the best practices. We have the DAMA Book of Knowledge, or DMBOK, and the Information and Governance Best Practices called ARMA, the IG Book of Knowledge, or IGBOK. Why use standards and best practices? In a word, the answer is success. Bobby and I are great fans of standards and best practices because they're also very useful. They give you a trusted framework that allows you to get creative using the framework to solve your practical problems. In addition, they can be evidence of your legal compliance in the event of an audit, investigation, or litigation. They can protect you from lawsuits. Standards and best practices can also fill in gaps in the law. The law of records in Canada is not well developed. There are few record statutes, and the case law from the courts is still developing. Using standards and best practices can reduce your risk of doing things wrong, and it gives you the comfort that you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you start a project or program. Using standards and best practices allows us to benefit from the wisdom and experience of experts. They also allow us to have compatibility with other forms of governments and organizations that are involved in your business. This is important when negotiating government to government, since other forms of government in Canada use standards and best practices a great deal in their business. In all, standards and best practices increase your efficiency and effectiveness, and that saves you time and money. This slide shows you a screenshot from the DG website. It provides an introduction to information, forms of governance, and management and administrative data. Now, this slide gives you the formalized definition of IG from ARMA's IG BOC. The definition emphasizes a cross-disciplinary framework, standards, accountability to achieve business objectives, prove compliance, and minimize risk. Now, IG does matter. It gives you a framework of rules and practices that ensures compliance with ARMA's 8 generally accepted record-keeping principles. The following 8 principles form the records management portion of IG. First, being accountable for care and quality of records. Being transparent about how records are managed. Demonstrating integrity by being moral, ethical, and honest. Actively protecting records with fireproof cabinets, scanning, and IT backups. Proving compliance by meeting legal retention requirements, adopting standards and best practices. Ensuring availability, being able to produce records for audits, privacy requests, or for legal proceedings. Applying retentions, which identify required legal or business retentions, and storing records for those time periods. And the 8th and final principle is conducting disposition. So when Bobby and I are talking about disposition, we're talking about one of 3 decisions made about the records at the end of the life cycle. One is the decision to destroy the record beyond reconstruction, or transfer that record to permanent business storage, or finally, succession to a third-party archive.
In this slide, you're going to see the graphic for what is information governance. And it shows you all of the areas of a government that would be involved in information governance. So you have your representation from your departments, which is considered your business. You've got privacy and security, you have IT, you have RIM, and you have legal. There are 5 roles working together to create and manage records flowing in a life cycle, which is the center of the graphic. If you don't see your government in this graphic, it's okay. This graphic was created for really large, typically US and European companies. And what we find is the most important takeaway is that you customize the graphic to represent your government.
And you use what facilities or people you have on hand as a starting point. And then over time, as you get more mature in your program, then you can develop more roles as you see fit.
So what we've done with this example is we've said, we don't see data management in our information governance circle. So we've added that section of the pie. And I know that with Indigenous governments, leadership and community has a lot more influence than you would have in a regular municipality. So it's a special government. So I think we need to create an information governance graphic that reflects the Indigenous government.
So as you start your journey with DG, self-assessment is an important first step. Knowing where you're starting from allows you to measure your success and benchmark your metrics. The DG Toolkit has a useful self-assessment tool for DM. On the second line on that slide on the left-hand side, the FNPSS has a IM Toolkit for RIM. The FNPSS is also developing a self-assessment tool for RIM, which will be available soon on their website. As well, ARMA has the IG maturity model, which is a standard records self-assessment tool. And there are 5 levels of maturity. The screen on the right-hand side is too small to read, I think, but I'll just give you a brief overview of the different levels, beginning with level 1. Level 1 means you're just starting out, that you don't have all the elements of your program in place yet. Level 2 means that your records management program is developing, but legal compliance may not be proven. Level 3 is essential, which means your RIM program is working well and you have minimal problems with compliance and efficiency. Level 4 is where you're being proactive, where IG is working well in the whole organization and IG is routinely integrated into the business. And finally, level 5 means your government is transformational and a leader in IG. Now, as Bobby mentioned before, this is a corporate model which we customize to the specific needs of the organization. And in our, I guess I've got 20 years, you've got over 10 years, various clients working with records. We see that most of our clients are varying between level 1, 2, or 3. We have not yet seen a level 4 or level 5 organization.
This is a graphic that I designed when I was trying to think through how I could show you how information governance and data governance fit together. So the circles that you see mid-screen across, you'll see business units, privacy and security, IT, risk, RIM, data management, and legal. Those represent what we had in the customized information governance graphic. And then below them, you're going to see 2 very different work functions, one of records management and one of data management. And then below that, you're going to see the sources of where both records management records are coming from and where data management data could be coming from. So baseline data, administrative data from the band office or your executive offices, third-party data such as StatsCan, third-party health data, community data by surveys, university researchers. So I hope that this helps define for you that there is a difference between the 2 of them, and they both have governance protocols.
So the next 3 slides show you a practical way that you can follow to leverage governance and business profiling as part of your IG process. The slide covers governance profiling. We first need to profile your government to find out what law applies to you, what you have to do to comply with that law as well as your own laws. Profiling is a useful tool because it can allow you to identify legal gaps as well. Since SGIGs have the power to create their own laws, we recommend that they legislate what records to create and how long to retain them. By doing so, this makes the disposition phase of the life cycle of the record easier since the law would clearly prescribe for how long to retain the records. Also on the slide is a fictional example that is based on a common line of business that we've seen in SGIGs and other First Nations organizations. The Silingatuk government provides medical transport services to their citizens. Citizens are reimbursed for their expenses when they seek medical treatment outside their territories. Medical transport records typically contain citizens' personal information, including information about their medical condition. Now, Silingatuk has its own privacy laws, but the medical transport services are funded by a provincial health authority, and the health authority must comply with the provincial privacy law. And what links the 2 together is they have a written funding agreement between the health authority and Silingatuk, which requires Silingatuk to comply with the provincial privacy law, not their own privacy law. So if a citizen has a complaint about how Silingatuk manages the citizen's personal information regarding medical transport, because of the funding agreement, Silingatuk must apply the provincial privacy law, not its own law. If Silingatuk applies the wrong law, they risk being in the wrong court and they could lose legal rights, not to mention the cost and time and money spent. There's a growing body of case law across the country where courts are being asked to determine what law applies: provincial law, territorial law, federal law, SGIG law. And the most common cases we're seeing are unjust dismissal cases from employment, workplace safety, and human rights. Addressing legal jurisdiction at the outset using profiling increases the SGIG's legal compliance and reduces the risk of errors and having to spend time and money.
So this slide shows you a governance profile for Salingatuk, and it observes all of the areas of law that could be coming into the government. And it allows you to consider different types of legislation. So for example, you'll notice that human rights is not in there. But it's important to understand how your agreements that you have with external governments or parties can impact the legal requirements around how your records are handled.
Moving on to business profiling, it allows you to understand how your records and information forms of management are impacted by the agreements your your governments have entered into with other entities. Now, best practice is to include what records under the agreement need to be created, who owns the records, and for how long they should be retained.
This graphic shows you a business profiling for Salingatuk. So it basically starts to define the government in an org chart style, and it shows centers of influence from community to deputy chief and council or executive leadership, and carries on through to the administrative offices and then the operational offices at the bottom. And when you define the services that are provided in your business model to your citizens, then you start having a better idea of the types of records and data that can be found in each of those departments. Then we go even further and we look for different types of software, because that's where our electronic records are going to be, and how many drives you have and how user workspaces and user experience interfaces are designed.
Also, what this allows you to do using maps, charts, and tables, it's a good way to test your assumptions, because you may say, well, we do back up all of our computers in any format. And then if you do your business profile, you can see in the top right that not all of those electronic not all of those computers are being backed up. And that's a concern, because without backups, we don't have the security for the data or for the protection. And we find with clients, this is a very useful exercise, because there are a lot of assumptions that folks have. And then once they go and do the profiling, they find out that they've got new information they didn't know they had, or they don't have the information that they assumed that they had. Administrative data are information created and maintained by Indigenous governments for the purposes of carrying out various business functions, but not for statistical programs. We have a list of administrative types that we've drafted where you can find administrative data. You can use this list to assist you in your research. I understand Allison has put the link, or will be putting the link for the document in the chat. So this slide asks the question, where are my paper records? Typically, they're in a range of places. We've listed some of the places our clients have their records stored. As you can see, the locations vary from the government buildings to private homes. Bobby and I are not fans of storing records in sea containers. Paper records are like people. They need air to breathe and can't live safely in spaces where it's too hot or too cold. Most sea containers are too hot in the summer and too cold in winter. As a result, often records stored in sea containers are damaged and deteriorate over time.
The same risks exist also with off-site storage units, where the temperatures are erratic, and you can find that the records are deteriorating through mold, silverfish, water damage, and you're at a risk of theft with off-site storage units.
Like with paper records, there are many places your electronic records could be stored. As we mentioned before, the first place you're going to find electronic records is on computer drives or C drives, or if you have a network shared drive. You'll also find records on portable, non-encrypted thumb drives. Records stored on portable non-encrypted thumb drives are at a high risk of being lost or stolen, which can create issues with reputation and community trust. As a result, it's not a best practice to use portable thumb drives. But if you have to use them, use an encrypted thumb drive that can be locked in a government safe. Line of business software like accounting software may run reports. These reports are very useful because they can provide you with specific data sets. Electronic records can also live in the cloud. This is an increasing feature of a lot of businesses around the country. Cloud storage and software as a service can be fickle by nature in that you're giving up the physical custodies of your records to a third party. Governments may want to mitigate their risk by ensuring that a copy of those records are also backed up onto the government's on-premise servers. Now, this slide shows our first steps in mapping electronic records across an Indigenous landscape. We want to know what software is being used by each of the departments and what types of records are stored in them.
So this is an aerial street map of the Salingatuk administrative buildings and roads. And you'll see over on the right-hand side, there's a yellow circle with a number in it, and that's for how many bankers' boxes are stored on site. The second is a green square that shows the paper records that have well-being data in them. And then there is also an icon for line of business software. So as you can see, we've been very detailed about identifying which of the departments are running out of which building and where the paper records are versus where we're going to be able to find well-being records throughout the administration.
As well, doing an aerial view gives you a sense of where your records are. And if you have in your government records stored across your territory where you're needing to drive, knowing what's in the specific departments might save you a drive and will save you time and money. If you can identify beforehand that there are no well-being data in particular areas.
Now we're going to transition over to records management. So the First Nations Public Service Secretariat is has a best practice for Indigenous governments for their records and information management toolkit. So that basically will support you in further developing or establishing a records management program. They also provide records and information management training through webinars. That's a really good online resource for you to be able to build capacity and understand everything that's involved in doing records management in a formal way in your government.
This section gives a high-level overview of RIM. As we mentioned, RIM is part of IG. RIM is an essential function for DG. RIM also provides a structure on how information is handled in both electronic and paper formats. And almost every organization that we've been working with has some form of paper and electronic. Increasingly, clients are moving to more electronic than paper, but I'm not confident in my career that we will see the end of paper and the creation of the paperless office. Whether paper or electronic, RIM follows a life cycle. The slide shows a graphic from ARMA from the beginning of the life cycle, which is the records capture. Then there's collaboration, version control, retention and storage, legal holds and discovery, and finally, disposition or archiving. What's interesting is that the RIM record lifecycle is very similar to the DG lifecycle. So we typically apply the life cycle of a record or data in 3 stages. We first create the record, that's the creator. Later, we may need to find the record. That's the second stage, the activity of the seeker. Third and finally, at the end of the life cycle, the record or data is disposed of by the dispositionist. And we apply discernment throughout. The goal is to get the right information to the right people at the right time. A record is information that is evidence of business or legal activities, and a record can be in any format. Formats vary. We've given you a common list of record formats, from agreements through to books, documents, letters, manuals, maps, videos, vouchers, down to wax cylinders. Now, a question for the chat. Is data a record? Anybody on the chat for that? Harmony, I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you think data is a record?
I am going, oh, Mark's in there before me.
Okay, well, let's get his views.
I'm grateful for Mark.
This is not a test. There's no right or wrong answer. It's your own experience.
So can you tell us what Mark is saying?
Mark is saying he guesses no. And then my brother Dylan says indubitably it is. And Sandra says no, but records are data. Jennifer says yes, data is a record. Data can also be used to create a record. That was kind of what I was thinking. Yes, I believe it is. When I think of data, I think about a collection of records. And then someone else says no, as data changes frequently, which is also a good point.
That's a great representation of our experience with the answer to that question, because from a records perspective, a record is something you need for regular business. So you could have data that's not needed for a legal requirement, for audit, or would not be required for your business. Or the data could be, depending on, again, what is the context of that particular information.
And that is where discernment is coming in.
Right. So there's a statement or a principle we have in RIM that says all documents, and I'd include data in this, all data, all documents are information. All records are documents or data, but not all data is a record. And the distinction that we work with in RIM is that, is it required for legal? And if it's not, is it required for business? If it's not, then it's not a record. It's either data or information or a document.
So that was a trick question.
Not really. It's to try and get us thinking through what is valuable and important for the information that we're collecting as a business.
We got some good stuff going in the chat, so I'm not the one who asked the trick question thing. That's pretty clever.
Well, if there's any blame us.
Next slide. So this is a really important graphic, and it's a logic graphic, and it can be found in the FNPSS RIM Toolkit, and it is really supportive in working through in your mind, defining what is and what is not a record. And you're going to see the term creator again in there, and it's going to allow you to have discussions with people on your teams about what is and what is not a record. And so I would encourage you to definitely go and get a copy of the IM Toolkit so that you've got tools like this for debates like, is data a record?
And it's free on the FNS website. And as well, we've had clients report that they'll take this particular record logic map and they'll customize it for other questions they may have in their organization. So you may have something like, is this data? And then have the logic map go from the first stage through to your decision stage.
And this is also a really great map to start engaging leadership with, right? Because they're able to sit down and work it through on their own and then be able to sit down and have a conversation. So the question is, what is in a RIM program? What do we want to have for a formalized RIM program? So everyone does records management. If we didn't, we wouldn't be in business. But to formalize a program brings awareness and cohesiveness inside of a government. And it sees the importance for documentation and formalization and training. So the very first step that we would want to start with is some sort of an authorizing document that would authorize the program. And the reason that you want to authorize your program formally is, number one, it's a primary indicator of general capacity and leadership buy-in. Then you want to pass a RIM policy. and have it drafted so that it represents the framework of your entire program. And then the next step would be to draft a classification plan and retention schedule. So that is basically a numeric, functionally based inventory of every single workflow in every single department of the government. And the retention portion on it is, does it have a business and or legal retention period? So that's super important, because you can't truly do legal disposition without those 3 steps in place. And then the next step would be to draft a records management procedures manual. And in that manual, you would have your workflows around records. You would have a scanning program formalized using ISO standards and ISO target quality controls to ensure that the equipment is working properly. You would have a disposition program that's formalized with certificates. You would have an email training program so that everyone speaks the same language about how you're going to manage email, department acronym lists, naming conventions that are prescriptive, and of course a glossary so that everyone from IT to RIM are speaking the same language. And if you do all of this together, that's information governance. But you also need to add a lot of training for records management for staff and leadership and change management.
And the basic premise is, the more complicated your business, the more complicated your record keeping is likely to be. In this slide, we talk about how RIM can support DM. Now, on the previous slide, we showed you the IG reference model, which has the 5 roles. We're going to profile 3 of them, the RIM, the legal, and the IT. So these are just some ideas that we have around how RIM can support DM. RIM could help draft the DM section of the classification plan. RIM and legal could work cooperatively together to define legal and business retentions. RIM could also support DM by drafting policies, procedures, guidelines, and workflows. RIM is very good at creating forms, templates, and spreadsheets, and naming conventions as well, which we'll have a couple slides on in a moment. Also, RIM can define the format of the official record, whether it's going to be in paper or in electronic for the DM records. And maybe some DM records might be in paper, some might be electronic. And finally, RIM can identify locations of data using records mapping. We've already shown you a number of examples of how you might want to be creative about that. The previous slide introduced how RIM can support data management with a naming convention. A naming convention is simply an agreed-upon format of labeling an electronic record. The creator of the record applies a naming convention to the record the first time it's saved. The naming convention allows the seeker to know what the document is without having to open the document. And the naming convention in this way is the seeker's most powerful and best tool for finding records. This is a fictional example of a naming convention for an SGIG for a data reporting record. The example on the top of the slide has 9 elements. This gives the seeker many choices to use to search. Seeker can search by CPRS primary number or by date, by title of the document, search by SGIG name or department name, search by version, search by author, or finally search by status or status version date. Now the file name for this data reporting record has 95 characters. Most computer systems have a limit of 256 characters for the file name. So that's done so that the system can properly save the record and make it available for future retrieval by the seeker. It's a best practice for you to keep your naming convention character lengths as short as possible. The slide also shows how you could create naming conventions for working records and the finalized records. The key takeaway with naming conventions is they're highly customizable by department, by organization, and they're very flexible and a very powerful tool to access electronic records. Legal counsel can support data management in a number of ways. If you don't have legal counsel available to you, then most organizations at some point will hire outside counsel if there's no in-house counsel. Legal can draft memorandum of understanding and other information sharing agreements. There's a page on agreements on the Data Governance Toolkit webpage. Legal can ensure agreements are legally enforceable in court, specify who's the record owner, how the records or data will be used, how long the data will be retained for business or legal purposes, and they can also define records retentions with RIM. For example, Bobby and I have a client whose band office staff has reported oral histories for their elders for use in research. The program has been going on for years. The program works so the elder signs a consent form allowing my client to use their stories. My client got an email from a lawyer from another First Nation asking that the transcripts for these oral histories be provided to the other First Nation in order to sue the government of Canada. The requested transcripts were from over 20 years ago. My client asked me, can we disclose the transcripts for litigation purposes? I didn't have an answer, I didn't know. So my client and I worked together. My client did some digging for records and I did the legal research. My client found the original signed consent forms from over 20 years ago. On the consent form was a statement saying the elder consented for the oral history to be used for research and quote, any other use required by the First Nation, including asserting legal rights, end quote. Now, since the consent form clearly contemplated litigation and also allowed the First Nation to decide how to use the information, my client was authorized by the elders to disclose their personal information in the transcripts to the other lawyer for a secondary purpose being litigation. Having signed consent forms meant my client had evidence to prove, the client was legally permitted to disclose in case anybody was going to challenge that decision. My client made the disclosure without expending a lot of time and without spending any money. Without the consents, though, my client would have had a difficult time, especially if elders had died since the research was completed. It would have raised a number of thorny questions. Does my client need to get consent at all if the elder has died? Or does my client need the elder's family's consent? Consent to the community? Or does my client have to go to court to get court approval to disclose? In this case, because of proper records management and the use of legal consents permitting secondary use, we didn't have to deal with any of that. Problem solved, my client was happy, everyone was happy. So this slide goes on to talk about how IT can support data. IT is a key worker, a key player in this process. They can create folders on the structured share drive. They can provide appropriate hardware. They can also advise the IG steering committee regarding reviews of software options for handling the data, and they can review the infrastructure of the IT system to leverage data gathering.
So let's think about where we could find well-being data. So I have an example for you. So what we're going to be looking for is the number of post-secondary tuitions that are paid for during a fiscal year. So let's assume that an Indigenous government wants to know how many of their citizens received post-secondary funding. Now, this is coming out of the executive director doing a risk analysis of what percentage of her staff are set to retire within the next 5 years. And she was absolutely dismayed to realize that over 50% of her administrative staff can retire within the next 5 years. So she said to her team on the steering committee, how can we find our graduates so that we can attempt to recruit them back to the government? So they decided that the first thing that they would do is they would go and look at the financial software, because that was really their only format of electronic reporting, because the education department is all in paper. So the very first thing that they did is they took a look at their records map, and they realized that although they could go to education, the electronic records could be mostly at finance. So they're looking to see, okay, what type of software has finance used over the years? And then where is my target years that I want to find viable graduates from? So it's important to understand the life cycle of specific data. For example, you may not have the original software that started collecting the data that you're looking for. So here's a nice kind of chart that I can start you off with that will demonstrate what we're talking about. So from 1973 to 91, which is 18 years, the finance department operated only in paper. There was no software. Now, CRA requires a 7-year retention on financial records. So it is completely possible that those records for that 18 years may not be available in paper. In 1991, the finance department got QuickBooks, and they ran that software until 2008. So that is 17 years of electronic records that are in a QuickBooks software. The only problem is that in 2008, Sage software was bought and is currently their running software. QuickBooks, portions of it were migrated into Sage, and then QuickBooks was taken off the server. So those electronic records are also not available. So now we have 13 years of records in electronic format that we could run a report on that's in Sage, and we may be able to access, 7 years of paper financial records. But the records that she was really looking for, if they're going through their disposition properly, they're gone. So it's really important to understand your formats of what format your records could be in, and then where they would be, and then your secondary sources when you find that you may actually have disposition holes in your record sets that you're hoping to get the data from.
So in conclusion, we have 3 main recommendations for you. First, use standards and best practices to ensure you're conducting your research is the best way to do things for you. Second, before you start your research, assess your government's profile for governance and business. That way you know what laws apply to you and what business you conduct in order to ensure you're creating the right information, can give it to the right people at the right time. Third, since your government may have a wealth of administrative data, before you start your research, map your information assets to find out what you have. Mapping both your government's paper and electronic records will provide you with a complete picture. Bobby and I thank you for your attention today. We would be pleased to take any questions you may have or listen to your comments about what we've said today.
Thank you both so much. That was a lot of information covered in a short amount of time. I think it was clear to me anyway that you both have done a lot of work in thinking about both conceptual frameworks as well as very practical frameworks and tools that I think folks that are on the line today and their colleagues can use in their context. If there are questions, feel free to jump them into the chat. We're gonna otherwise take a break. I did want to just take a second to note that there's kind of 2 sources for tools on this probably. There's the Toolkit, the Indigenous Data Governance Toolkit. Some of the tools I understand are in different stages of being uploaded to that site. So if you don't see something right away, loop back later. So for example, all of that content that Bobby and Stuart started out with respect to standards, there'll be a bit of a summary of all the standards available to you and links to those standards. So those tools are still being developed and will be uploaded to the site. And then there's the First Nations Public Service Secretariat RIM toolkit. There's, I think, 2 parts to that toolkit, and I popped the link to that in the chat. It's somewhere lost in the chat in the middle there. There is a question in the chat. Is it ethical to look up information on citizens through payments made to them? So tuition, for example, or some sort of contract. Is it ethical to look up information on them through payments made to them?
What we want to have, first of all, is when the student gives the information, the student signs a consent form that allows the government to make use of the information for a specific use. And it's the best practice to list those specific uses. And it may include things like research. Mm-hmm. If it doesn't, though, the typical principle is that in privacy law that we consent for a specific use. And if it's not listed in a written consent, then it's for that one use. So if you're looking up information for the purpose not related to the original collection, or there's no consent that lists all the different uses that you can look up the information, you may be in danger of a privacy breach and subject to a privacy complaint if the citizen finds out about information being examined and maybe even shared in a way that's contrary to the original use and collection and consent, and that can get folks into trouble. I like to talk about this as the grandmother principle. If you have information about people, would you want people talking about your grandmother's information, her personal information? And if the answer is no, you're probably not doing the right things.
Yeah, the point about like thinking at the beginning about consent models, I think ties in closely with what we heard from Hannes and Rebecca at the last session about take the time at the beginning of any data collection effort to plan before doing. Because thinking about, and your example was really interesting one, Stuart, about 20 years later, all of a sudden we need that data for a different purpose. And if you didn't kind of really think big at the beginning of that process, like whoever was involved in that initial consent process for that client was very forward looking to have
Very
included
smart,
that purpose. Very smart person. That's right.
So share that story, tell that story. I was skeptical. I didn't think we would get the consents, but there they were. It was written in very plain language. The elders had the consent explained to them. Some of them didn't speak English, so it was explained to them in their own language, and there was no conflict. There's no problem with the community. So it was a really great success story. And the best thing about it from the government's point of view is it didn't take a lot of time and it didn't have to spend any money.
So there are a couple of folks here with us today from Big River Analytics, Rebecca, who was here last time, and Layla, who is new to the group, and I will let them introduce themselves. Over to you, Rebecca and Layla.
Great, I'm just going to share a screen here. Good to see everyone again who was on the last webinar. Can everyone see this okay? Great. So I'm grateful to be joining you today from the territory of the Lekwungen speaking people, so the Wet'suwet'en, Songhees, and Esquimalt nations. Unpredictably, my neighbors are on the skill saw day of installing their staircase. So there is a lot of background noise. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm not seeing any confused looking faces. So it seems like the audio is coming through okay, but if it gets too bad, I do have some headphones I can plug in and see if that's any better.
So far, so good. Your screen on the left on my end is looking a little bit cut off. Can I see nods from anyone else?
Yeah, it is cut off.
How about now?
I think you need to full screen. Okay, looking better. Yeah.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So really excited to be back speaking with the group again today. For folks who maybe weren't on the webinar, the last webinar last week, I'm from Big River Analytics. My name is Rebecca. Big River has been operating for the last 9 years, and we've done hundreds of projects with Indigenous governments, communities, and organizations from across Canada. Originally based in Terrace, BC, which is Tsimshian territory. So many of our first clients are from there and remain clients today. And overall, our mission is to provide statistical and analytical capacity to benefit Indigenous communities. And so this has ranged from, making use of economic tools and data collection and data analysis, what we talked about more concretely in our last webinar, to benefit Indigenous communities by, potentially securing funding for those communities, to helping governments set up and make use of and manage new data systems. So we're an interdisciplinary team. We've got data scientists and management specialists, economists and statisticians, who all help to provide that value back and make use of data to benefit Indigenous communities. My background, I'm Welsh and British on my mother's side, and Ukrainian and a mix of Eastern European on my father's side. I'm really excited to have Layla here joining us today. She recently joined the team, and I'll let her introduce herself before we dive into some of the content.
For sure. Hi, everyone. When Rebecca says recently, she means like really, really recently. Like I think today is a month exactly that I've been with Big River. But I am based in Toronto, Dishwood One Spoon territory since 2018. And I'm currently on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Chippewa, Wendat peoples, Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe. I'm originally from Southeast Europe. I'm Serbian and Bosnian, and I'm a very, very freshly baked immigrant here. So my background is also in political science and international relations. And I then moved into data privacy and data security. And I'm sharing all this just so that you know that what I try to do is I try to put a social justice and political lens onto data security and privacy, which is something I don't think we do enough. And that's what we're going to try and share with you today. And just one heads up is that I'll be using government, organization, and team and all of these terms interchangeably, just so that I do justice to all the different structures and hierarchies that may exist. So you'll hear the different terms, but they're all meant to refer to you.
Great, thanks, Leila. So in terms of our agenda today, we're going to start by talking a little bit about the motivation for some of this work. I think that this will carry through a lot of different threads from some of the previous webinars. We have our 3 key takeaways. So if you were on the webinar last week, this won't be a surprise. This is our 3 things we're hoping you can take away from this webinar in pretty concrete and explicit terms. We have some key terms and concepts to understand, and really the objective here is to give you a starting point, to give you some of the language and key principles and topics really focused on privacy and security. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the data management lifecycle and some data quality pieces, and what are the questions that you should be asking yourself to be integrating security and privacy into your data management lifecycle. We also have some strategies and approaches for phase 1. So this is great to have had Bobby and Stuart share some very similar principles and practices in terms of mapping out where your data is, what some of the risks might be, to help you understand what the security and privacy approaches might be that are appropriate. So I think there's lots of alignment between some of the records management and consent pieces that we heard from Bobby and Stuart's presentation and some of the principles and concepts we'll be sharing with the group today. So before we dive into the webinar content we have outlined, there's lots more information that's available on the toolkit that we're not going to present today. And so I'm going to take a few minutes to just walk through some of those components of the toolkit, and also just share a little bit about kind of why we landed on the focus for today. So as I mentioned, the objective is getting some foundational understanding, some foundational concepts and principles, but really this is a complex topic. This is something that takes a lifetime of learning. Even security mature organizations who've been working on this for many, many, many years, this isn't something that's complete and that you put to bed. This is something you continue to maintain and work on. And knowing that, as Bobby and Stuart said, many of the governments are in different places and along different kind of phases of this spectrum. Some of this content will be more or less relevant to your government and your community, depending on where you're at. So we've tried to focus on information that's relevant kind of regardless of where you're at in the spectrum. What does that spectrum look like? And I'll show you some of the material that might be more or less relevant that's on the toolkit online that's a little bit more specific. The other thing to kind of keep in mind around these topics is many of them are, like I said, specific to your organization. And oftentimes when you're faced with a data issue or data management issue or security issue, we just jump straight to solutions. We jump straight to the system as a solution. And what we really want to think about is a system isn't necessarily a solution. The data management lifecycle shows how all these pieces link together and are related to each other. And it's important not only to understand the system you're using or the system you're not using, but also those policies and practices. And some of those might be, depending on where you're at, those might just be implicit policies and practices that haven't actually explicitly been put down on paper. But getting an understanding of what's going on the ground before you jump to a system as a solution is really important. So we do talk about IT procurement in the actual toolkit, but we're going to focus on, like I said, some of those core concepts around privacy and security today. So I'm just going to switch screens. Does everyone see the toolkit? Great. So up here, you can get into all of the different topics covered in the toolkit. Today, we've been talking about data management. We will be talking about the data lifecycle, And then here on the side, you can go to some of the other topics that are covered. So we have IT systems. So for governments that are thinking about procuring a new system or thinking about assessing some of their existing systems, we have some information for you on how to identify what a system requirement might be. So if you are thinking about buying a system, what are some of the questions that you might ask yourselves and your staff before you go about purchasing a specific system? The total cost of ownership. So there's a bunch of different models for software. So how do you actually assess what this is going to cost in terms of your lifetime of using this software? Maintenance being one component. So there's lots of different components that you can use in here to assess the cost of your ownership. And then once you've made some of those decisions, how do you go about making a business case or actually putting out a request for proposals? So lots of good information on IT in there that we won't cover in much detail today. In terms of data quality, we are going to talk about data quality because these things are all interconnected. Your IT system and your system design will influence the data quality your administrative data sets produce. But there is more detail here on things like metadata, so your documentation. I think it's great that Bobby and Stuart shared so much information on things like naming conventions and those actual details to records management, because all of those complement data quality. If you don't have those good record management systems in place, it becomes really difficult to make use of and actually build indicators out of the information that you have. We will talk a little bit about quality assurance, but again, lots more details in the webinar, or sorry, in the toolkit there. We do talk about storage and data backup and preservation a little bit. And again, this was covered with some of the points in Bobby and Stuart's presentation, but the kind of take home message that we have related to privacy and security here and data quality is just that these things will dictate whether you can or can't access that information, and the way that you go about collecting that information will have implications in terms of whether you archive or store it and how you go about actually picking those solutions. The focus of our presentation is data security and privacy. There's lots of information on principles and concepts here. We try to draw some of those into our presentation. But again, like I said, this is kind of a lifetime of learning here. So there's lots more detail, and we try to highlight some of those key foundations that can inform your thinking when you're going through collecting and using data. So I'm going to switch back to the presentation now. And we're going to start with some motivations. So I think, we've all been part of these webinars for a few weeks now. So there's been lots of motivation around privacy and security and things to think about. I think the piece that I'll speak to, and then I'll pass it over to Layla to speak to those first 3 points here, is around the strength of your privacy and security capacity really being linked to your ability to unlock new data avenues. And so we've seen some examples with Bobby and Stuart. If you have thought through your privacy and consent model, having that completed and identifying the different uses for data allows you to actually make use of that data in the future. So having a strong privacy and security program unlocks the capacity for you to use some of your own internal data sources. Similarly, oftentimes, and I was speaking with Harmony about this before our webinar, privacy and security considerations are the things that other organizations tell you, this is the reason you can't have access to your data. So it also has the potential, if you enhance those programs, then you have the potential to access new and more different types of data about your citizens. And so, that's kind of one motivation for why we're here, but I'll pass it over to Layla to speak to some of those other points.
Yeah, I think that one of the main things that we wanted to share today, and lots of information is being thrown at you. And if you remember a few things from today, what we wanted to do today is make cybersecurity, data security, and data privacy more accessible and help you advance on that journey wherever you are, whether you're at the start, whether you're kind of in the middle and are trying to improve. We wanted to help you get a little bit ahead, but also demystify all of this. One of the biggest points, and something that I know has helped me reframe the way I think about data privacy security, is that we often forget that personal data we're working with, those are actually people, those are actually individuals, and those are their real lives. So if anything goes wrong with that data, you're putting people's real lives in danger. So if you compromise that data, anything can happen. It could be a data leak. It could be a threat actor, a third-party threat actor that comes in and wreaks havoc on your systems. You could press the wrong link. It happens to anyone and everyone, and you download malware and it compromises your whole network. So this is something that you have a responsibility to protect individuals that are entrusting you with their data. You have the responsibility to protect the communities that are entrusting you with their data. But more than just thinking of, oh, I need to be compliant with a certain regulation or a certain law not to get in trouble, whatever that means, this is more a moral responsibility to protect people who are trusting you, to protect the communities. And also an added layer is the fact that we are having traditional knowledge that is now becoming digitized. And we need to ensure that that is also protected. And we'll get into more detail on what that looks like. But remember that the main idea here is enable you to protect the people that are trusting you, and also make this a little bit more accessible, because I know that cybersecurity and data privacy can often seem like a little bit of a black box or intimidating. So organizations and governments will rather maybe not deal with it in detail because it can seem so overwhelming. And we have some actual actionable steps for you that you can follow to get ahead of this journey.
Great, thanks, Leila. So our key 3 takeaways here. Takeaway number 1, privacy and security are part of every aspect of data management. So if there's one thing, well, if there's one of 3 things you can take away today, we would say the first one would be to really think about this not as separate from any of the other webinar topics you've seen or any of the other work and processes that you might be considering. This is a part of the day-to-day activities of your organization or your government. This is part of your government's culture. And think about the training and requirements that are needed to integrate this into everyday thinking. And so we have some questions to ask yourself at different phases of the data management lifecycle to start integrating some of this thinking into day-to-day activities. The second takeaway is to set some realistic expectations for your privacy and security program. So this is something that really takes time. As Leila said, it can be intimidating for an organization or a government of any size to think about these topics. The risks feel real, and we all know that the risks exist, but this isn't something that you can change overnight. So understanding that this is a security maturity spectrum. I like this word because it rhymes. Leila introduced security maturity to me and it was great. Now I use it all the time. But this is something that you do in phases, right? So you might be, in phase 1 where you're trying to get a sense of all of the systems and data that you have, or you may have already done some of that mapping or be really excited to use some of Bobby and Stuart's new tools to do some of that mapping and be thinking more about risk. So what are the risks associated with some of those systems and tools and that you're already using and the data that is implicitly being collected or explicitly you're going out and collecting using those. And really the objective here is to get to the final phase, which isn't the tick box, great, I'm done my security and privacy work. It's about maintaining and improving those systems. So setting up some foundations so that you're getting away from building the new and starting to maintain and improve on what systems and processes you have in place.
Yeah, and if it means anything, if you try and do this overnight, you're not going to do a good job. So there's no way you can just kind of implement everything in a month and think that you have everything ready. It takes time, and a good data privacy, data security program really takes a long time to build out, and you shouldn't rush that process.
Takeaway number 3, so data becomes sensitive when it has enough context. So if you know a phone number, but you don't know whose phone number it is, or if you know a password, but you don't know what system the password actually is for or who the password belongs to, that information is less sensitive than when it's combined with those other things. And so this is part of understanding data allows you, and understanding where that context is allows you to start thinking about ways that you can minimize risk from the data that you do have, collect and store data in a way that minimizes that risk. And also be able to make, like we kind of said in the motivation, to be able to make use of more and different types of data. If you know what context combining these 2 pieces together will create that sensitivity, then you're going to be able to use more and different data sources, knowing like what you need to do to minimize the risk to actually use this. So we see a lot of governments and organizations that we work with who have a lot of fear of using any of their data or putting any of their data in a certain type of system because they really are cognizant of the potential risks. And the more you understand about data and what makes data sensitive and what that context is and can do with data, the more you'll be able to kind of make informed decisions about where it's useful and where it's applicable and where it's appropriate to use data versus where you really need to be cognizant of some of those privacy and security concerns.
Yeah. And you can also think about whether you really need that data to be in clear text and readable, or if it's something that, it doesn't have to be the actual SIN number, for example, or it can be coded into like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you can just use it. So it's supposed to make you think about what format of the data do you actually need for it to be useful.
So we have some key terms and concepts to understand here. I'm going to let Leila take charge here and just tell me when you want to advance slides. And we're going to take a look through what we mean by governance, IT, cybersecurity, privacy, data management, and data. But importantly, what the differences are between these two terms, because oftentimes or at least, we think of these things all combined, and it's hard to understand where the lines are because these things are all interconnected. So
Yeah.
Leila, over to you. I can advance to the next slide.
Yeah, for sure. You can do that already. So the main idea is to decouple these terms, as Rebecca said, because the number of times somebody has told me that they work in IT, and I'm thinking you might as well have told me that you work with paper, because that's how broad IT is. And I'll hear people telling me they work in cybersecurity, they work in privacy, they work in information security, all of these terms, and sometimes they get conflated and confused. And we have this, I think, relatively useful analogy with the library that helps you understand all of these differences. So if we think about data, and I know this goes in line with the previous presentation, so I might get challenged in this after that records discussion, but if you think about data, a type of data, just one piece of data is like a word in a book. So if it's not correlated with other words to form sentences, words and data do not mean much separately. And you can think of data sets as books, because data sets tend to tell a complete story and give individual words power. So you have data that turns into data sets or sentences, and then even larger data sets that are books. Now, data management within this library metaphor would be the process of acquiring the books, of storing them, classifying them, shelving them, moving them around aisles, archiving them, keeping track of them through a system. So anything that you would do to manage those books and move them around and keep track of them. Now, privacy would be understanding which books have sensitive stories, which ones need to be kept safe, who should have access to them, and if it's only a select group of people, making sure that they're locked away or written in a secret language only a few understand. So you start thinking about them in a slightly different way. Now, cybersecurity is all of the measures that you would have in place to keep the book safe. Now, this can include anything from the fire extinguishers to the system you're using to know where the books are, who has access to the books, the building alarm, everything that is kind of meant to keep the books in a good shape and to keep them safe. Now, the next level, and the one where everybody tells me that's what they do, is the IT level. And the IT level means pretty much anything involved with the library. So we're talking about the words in the books. We're talking about the books themselves, the aisles, the shelves, the extinguishers, classifying and archiving software, your access controls, meaning who can enter, who can get a library card, plus all the librarians and all the staff working there. You're also thinking about the architecture of the building itself, the plumbing and electricity, everything else the library run. What I'm trying to say by this is that IT can be anything, from your website, the front end and back end of your website. It is your network. It is how you're storing the files, where are you storing the files. It includes absolutely everything that is technology. And when somebody says IT, that is what they mean. So IT is absolutely anything that is digital involved with your government. And the final layer we're looking at is the governance layer. So what do we mean when we say your data security and data privacy governance structure? Think about it as, again, the librarians who are running the library, all the people who run the library, and the guidelines and policies that define how they do their jobs. So in this case, they know what they need to do and how they need to do it, but a proper data privacy and data security structure would involve kind of having the chief information security officer, or having, knowing who your privacy designate is, knowing if you need legal counsel for your privacy. And then if you have the capacity to have specific people in charge of specific domains, so you have a network security person who owns that domain, or antiviral, so to speak, malware defense person who is in charge of that domain. So I hope that when you look at this graphic, it helps you decouple some of these terms and makes things a bit clearer. You can go to the next slide, yeah. We already discussed this, kind of how you need to think about data sets and how data, when it's put into a larger context, becomes more and more dangerous, and how you need to think about what that context is and what that needs to be. So I think that we can move ahead.
So we're going to talk about the data management lifecycle a little bit. Our focus is going to be twofold. First, on data set and data system quality and how those things relate to IT. You can imagine how excited we were to help contribute to the Toolkit IT component, with IT being such a broad definition. So there's lots, hence the reason why there's lots of content on the website that we're not going to be touching on today. But we are going to talk about the data management lifecycle as a core component for you to help you understand how these pieces of the puzzle fit together, and then talk about this data set and data system quality. And then Layla will walk through some questions that allow you to build some capacity and thinking around privacy and security in each of these phases. So this is a screenshot of the graphic that exists on the website. The data management lifecycle is this inner orange ring. So this is about identifying what your data source is. Once you've identified that source, transferring that source over and acquiring that data. So there's lots of privacy and security considerations that might need to be in place depending on where that data source is and what the original consent forms and process for actually collecting that data were. Once you've acquired that data, there's a whole kind of focus around analyzing that data, and that's usually about building those indicators for tracking at this stage and kind of the focus of this webinar series. And some things to think about in that vein are, what are the IT potential systems and tools and software that you're using, and how do those systems and software interact with your data? Communicating and sharing knowledge built from your data. That's the fun part, the exciting part, the part that we're all most looking forward to. But there's also some privacy and security considerations for how you present that data, how you make decisions around what you're doing to actually bring forward the information that you've analyzed to wider audiences. We've already talked a little bit about preservation and archiving and deletion of records, so we won't focus too much on that today. But really, the important thing to realize is that these are all interconnected. So the quality of your data oftentimes relies on your information technology systems, which oftentimes relies on the processes that you have in place around this data management lifecycle. Similarly, your storage and backup, this will influence the ability for you to actually acquire data. So if you have an administrative system that stores data in a particular way, that may or may not allow you to make use of that information to build an indicator of interest. And security and privacy really here wraps up in every phase, in every component and piece of this puzzle. So this isn't a discrete piece. The pieces of the puzzle really encompass this entire graphic. So when it comes to data system and data set quality, again, like I said, these things are all interconnected. So there's a few kind of core concepts that we go into more detail in the toolkit here around. But when we think about data system quality, we want to think about there being some some principles that we found really useful to think about this thing is making sure that there's a single source of truth. So what is your authoritative understanding of a data set? And, some of the governments that we've worked with in the past have, and to kind of Hannes's point in our webinar last week, really invested in their membership and citizens list. And they have that single authoritative source of truth of who is a member, who is a citizen of their nation. Other nations who are kind of in different areas of the spectrum have competing lists for this. And it generates a lot of challenges in terms of making use of that data, because you have, multiple different lists that say there's multiple different numbers of people that are members. So single source of truth is a useful concept to think about when you're thinking about data system quality, and data system quality is really spanning across multiple data sets across all of the different IT systems that might be generating data. Again, we talk about this in more detail in the toolkit, but a lot of these things are related. So many of the quality assurance and best practices that you can have relate to what type of system you're using. So the principles that we'll talk about in terms of data set quality could be useful if you're working in an Excel sheet or if you're designing a custom database system. And the quality assurances and best practices depend on kind of what tool you're using and where you're at in that process. When we talk about data set quality, so you'll see lots of linkages between data set quality and some of the system implications here. But when we talk about high quality data, we want to talk about data that's accurate. So is the information actually factual? Is my birth date stored correctly at the record level, or is it the incorrect date? We want to talk about consistency as well. And so there's some clear linkages between your data systems here, because oftentimes those data systems will define how your data is entered. Is information entered consistently? So, for instance, is my income listed as hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars or just as my income? If that is listed inconsistently and people are entering it differently because they have a different implicit or explicit policy or procedure for how they enter that information, it's going to make it really challenging to actually make use of this information from an indicator perspective. Is the information complete? So is there a record for me? Is there a record for Layla? Is Layla and my first and last name there, or do we just have a record for me and not for her? Uniqueness. So this is again linking to that concept of a single source of truth. So are there multiple records for me and multiple records for Layla? If so, is there a reason for that, or is that an error? And how do you work through those kind of record management components when you do find that there are duplicate records? But similarly and importantly, especially when you're thinking about a project and data collection or data system design from the outset, are there duplicate concepts? So do I store both my date of birth and my age? If so, why? Because we want to try to limit the amount of information we're collecting and create a single source of truth around what the appropriate field or record is for that individual. Excuse me. Timeliness is the data available and updated and processed in a timely manner? And then relevance here, does it actually measure what it's supposed to measure? So thinking about relevance in terms of a data set, if you're trying to build an indicator around someone's employment history and you ask them what job they held 10 years ago, that might give you an indication of what their employment was, but it's probably more accurate to actually go back and look at their employment record or their income record to see what their employment was, because people have difficulty recalling kind of that far into the past. So again, this is just to give folks a sense of how these systems interact and influence data set quality, and how data set quality can inform the indicators that you are able to create and collect and analyze out of all of this IT kind of infrastructure. I'm going to pass it over to Layla, because our second kind of focus for the data management lifecycle is about building privacy and security into every phase of the data lifecycle. So we've put together some questions for consideration for each of those phases, and I will pass it over to her.
Sure. So yes, this is our attempt to kind of ground things a little bit more, because everything that we have said so far has been relatively abstract and perhaps doesn't really give you anything to act on and to be able to fully understand how you need to approach data security and privacy. So what we did is that we took that very nice graphic that we have of the data management lifecycle and took those phases and kind of tried to put all the questions in there that you need to be asking yourself in each phase. So for example, in phase 1 and 2, when you're just identifying your data sources and starting to acquire the data, you need to think about, am I collecting data in a secure way? What that means is, how am I receiving it? Is it being mailed to me in paper form where all of that data, if it's interrupted, it can be read? How am I collecting it? Are people emailing it to me? Are they emailing it to one central email account? Who has access to that email account? Am I collecting consent from individuals? And we saw how important consent is in the previous presentation. But in this case, when you're gathering information from individuals, you want to make sure that you're collecting it, number one, but that you're also recording it properly, because if somebody comes and asks you about it, you will have access to it. Have you informed all of the individuals properly about what you're going to do with their data and what data sets you're going to be collecting from them? Do I really need to share, collect, store all this data, or only a few of these data sets necessary? So that's data minimization that we've touched upon a couple of times. And can I anonymize this data as soon as I get it, or do I need it fully readable? So these are just a few things that you can think about. Rebecca, if you go to the next slide, I think this continues. Oh, no, we are already phase 3 and 4, so you can go back up. So in that phase, when you're collecting everything, if you start by asking yourself these questions, you're already kind of ahead and you're doing the right thing. So if you move to the next one, analyzing data and communicating, sharing knowledge, this means that you already have control of that data. So you're again thinking, who truly needs access to this data and these files? Does my whole government need access to this, or is it only a few people that should be seeing these? what tools am I using to analyze this data? Are these custom in-house developed tools our internal IT team is in charge of, or are these vendor systems? Do I know if the vendor can read all of my data, or is it zero knowledge, meaning that even if it's on their servers, that company can still read that data? And if they get hacked, the good thing is that in that case, the hackers can't read their data because they hack their servers and everything is encrypted. So you want to know who you're giving that data to, if it's a vendor solution, and how it's being kept safe. Are we storing and sharing any sensitive data on movable media, USB, external hard drives, and CDs? This is becoming less and less common and less necessary because it is very unsafe and very difficult to track. How many thumb drives are out there, how many CDs are out there? If you can avoid this, that's great. I know it's not possible in every situation, but if you can avoid movable media, that might be best practice, especially now in this new COVID world where everything's being shared digitally. You want to make sure that you do have contracts as well with any of the vendors. So because then you will know exactly what the vendor system is doing. So these are all considerations that you go through as you're going through the life cycle management process. If you go to the next slide, again, if you really have to use movable media, is it protected by a password? Is it encrypted? Or if I drop it, is somebody going to be able to read it? Then when we are analyzing the data and sharing it, how are we communicating it? Am I just emailing it on any network? Are the networks password protected? Are we using virtual proxy private networks? That means that the data that is being sent is encrypted in transit. Are we only accessing the data from password protected devices that have current antivirus software installed in them? And this is a big pain point for a lot of organizations, companies, and governments, because everybody suddenly had to move and work from home, which meant that people were scrambling and just trying to do their work from any device that they could. But very often our private devices are not taken care of the way they should be, or even if they are given to us by our employer, they're not always taken care of the way they should be. So at this point, you need to think about, well, even if I'm accessing this data from a central server, that's my government server, where am I storing this data? Am I downloading it onto my device that really isn't that safe?
And I think another point here on analyzing data and communicating and sharing knowledge is just around some of that context. So many governments, if you're working in a small community and you're combining two different data sources together and you're analyzing and communicating that data, is it reasonable that in analyzing and developing an indicator in a particular way, you're actually revealing more about individual citizens than you might have originally anticipated? So not only the nuts and bolts of how data is shifting hands or being communicated in that way, but also whatever your final product is. If you start narrowing down to a demographic of 30 to 40-year-olds who are female and employed in a certain way in a small community, combining all those pieces together means you go from a picture where you think you've, reasonably have no privacy concerns to when you start to see, actually, I can figure out who the three people are in this data set with relative ease. So having an eye to those, the ways in which data combined can be powerful and can start to have those privacy considerations.
The next piece is going to be communicating, sharing knowledge. And
I
again,
stole your thunder, Layla.
Sorry?
I stole your thunder.
You did steal my thunder, but that is more than okay. I think that you do have these questions in here that are helpful, but what you're going to notice is that these questions have a pattern, have a theme, and very often the theme is access. And that is one of the first things that any organization, any government can do to secure themselves, which is access. Knowing how to control it, how to take it away quickly, how to keep track of who has access to what file and who has access to what shared drive or anything else. And you'll see when you go through these questions, when I'm not rushing through them and trying to walk you through them, you'll see that a lot of them, it's access. And that I can guarantee you is the pain point for a lot big companies, not just smaller organizations and smaller governments. So if that helps, access is your kind of first thing on the agenda. Now, the next one, you'll see preserve and archive. So this is once you're already kind of ready to preserve and archive and store everything that you've been doing. What tool are you using to archive and preserve this data? Is it, again, in-house? Is it vendor? Is it safe? Do they have a history of data leaks and data breaches? Do we know how long we need to have this data archived, and what is the data retention period? Do you know if you need to have this saved for 7 years, for example, because of legal reasons or regulations? Do you need to preserve the full copy of the data, or can you redact some of it? Or do you need to just kind of dump it and archive it in full readable text, even if it has some sensitive data? Because if you can redact and if you can minimize that data footprint, that can be very, very useful and can help keep your organization safer. You can go to the next one. Has the archive been, has the archive been tested for disaster recovery? And we've heard in the previous presentation that there's a lot of talk about backups. What you also need to make sure is that those backups are tested, that once a year, every 6 months, depending on what works best for you, is that you try and get that backup back onto your device and see if that actually works. And if you do get actual data that's readable and actual data that's actionable, because what we've seen is that even if it's backed up, and then when something does happen, people try to recover the backup and something goes wrong. The files are corrupted or something fails, and you don't want to be in that situation. Again, there's access again. Who has access to the archive? How do you keep track of who has access to it, and how quickly can you revoke it? Because if there's a set of credentials that ends up being compromised, like my password and my email, and I suddenly get access to your archive, how quickly can you get me out of there, rather than whoever it is that stole my credentials kind of has the ability to download and get to everything? And are the archives encrypted at rest? Meaning not just in transit over VPNs when you're sharing it, meaning also when you store it, wherever that you are storing it, whether it's locally or on a vendor solution, that it is encrypted at rest, and nobody can read it until they actually enter that encryption key. We can go to the next one. Delete, destroy. So this ties into the first phase as well, and it is a cycle for a reason. But do you know exactly where all your data and files are that you've been working on since you collected them? Where has it been copied? And that's why movable media is really, really dangerous, because it can be copied easily. There's no logs of who copied it, who shared it, and who got access to it. So you don't know where it's kind of been proliferated. And you also need to think about how are you deleting this data from your archives and your devices, because clicking the delete button doesn't always get rid of everything. You're not always kind of done. It's just like, okay, it's gone. It tends to stick around some database, some server, or somewhere where you don't want it. I think that's the end of our questions. The next phase is something we're hoping will help you start this cybersecurity and data privacy journey a lot easier, which is the phase 1 of your security maturity, Rebecca's new favorite phrase. So the first thing that you need to do, I'm not saying you probably have already done this and you have a good lay of the land and know where everything else, but if you haven't, or if things have been kind of moving through quickly, especially during this past year when everything suddenly became digitized, you want to identify all the platforms you're working with. You want to make sure that you know what you're using to communicate with people, what you're using to collect, handle, or store data. And you want to know the difference between collecting, handling, and storing data. So that all of those phases, that you know exactly what you're using and how the data is traveling between each other. And that is what is meant by data mapping or data flows. So that you're not suddenly surprised and you're like, oh, well, my Slack solution speaks to my Gmail. Oh no, well then what has been shared with Gmail? What do we have in there? Or what the Slack is speaking to another solution? Okay, what has been shared? You want to keep track of all of that. And this is just phase 1, which means sit down and figure out where you are and where all your data is. And that's going to be phase 1. So you're not rushing into suddenly implementing a ton of solutions, implementing a ton of cyber security controls or data security controls. That takes time. Your first phase is to calmly sit down and map everything out.
Okay. And just a reminder on our 3 key takeaways here. So again, privacy, security, and are part of every aspect of data management. So we saw all the questions you can be asking yourself, how these different pieces fit together, and really keeping that top of mind is important to build that culture and not just react with a solution or a system, but actually build the culture and have it ingrained in all the work that you're doing. Set those realistic expectations. So if you didn't know the answer to many of the questions that Layla ran through in terms of those data management phases, that's okay. Start by mapping out the systems, assessing the risk, and then figuring out where the attention is most needed and working in that space first. And then lastly, data becomes sensitive when it has context. So what do you need to anonymize? Can you redact components? All of those questions are about understanding what is sensitive, what makes data sensitive, and how you can still actually effectively work with and use data despite the need to have those privacy and security pieces in place.
And if I could just add very, very quickly onto why a system is not a solution right away. That's because one system, everything can get hacked. If somebody tells you that whatever they're giving you is not hackable, that means they're trying to hack you and you need to run. Because absolutely everything can get hacked, and one system is going to have its gaps. So that's why you need to use multiple different systems to kind of close those gaps between them. And you have different data security controls that will help close those gaps in systems. But don't rely on just one, that's for sure. And again, no matter how well everything is put in place, you're never 100% sure, and don't expect to be 100% sure, because as long as you're online, as long as you're using online tools, you're taking on a certain amount of risk, and that is okay as long as you know what risk you are comfortable with.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you so much. Inviting any questions or comments. I also just wanted to flag before that, we did put together some more detailed appendices that talk about the security focus areas, privacy focus areas. So what these mean in more kind of practical terms on the ground, and then some of those governance components, as well as the different phases. And we'll share those with the group after the presentation, so you have access to that material, and it helps kind of pull a few threads from different components of the toolkit together into one place. So thank you very much for having us, and any questions or comments, happy to field them.
Sure.
That was really great, like really clear and well structured. And I think, again, your message is really well taken about take time at the beginning to plan carefully, understand the lay of the land before you jump into doing anything, purchasing anything, working with a vendor on a solution. I've certainly seen many times like, well, we just need a system for this, and then let's customize it 25 times, and then people didn't know what the system was for, and then nobody uses it. So I think that was just very, very helpful. Any questions? Asking folks to throw those in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand. This topic is an area that can feel really scary to people, but I do think that the way both you and Stuart and Bobby described this concept of like, think of the actual people, think of your grandmother, think of others that, how do you want to protect them? And this harkens back actually to Gwen Phillips in webinar 1, who spoke to how data is about, we want to collect data, we want to use data because we care. And that's a grandmother perspective. This isn't a big brother perspective about gathering data in order to surveil people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I just thought that was a really nice thread as someone who's been kind of on all of these webinars, to hear that analogy of grandmother come through and bookend this series.
There's another grandmother analogy, which doesn't entirely speak to that, but it says, essentially, don't post anything online you wouldn't be comfortable if they printed it out and gave it to your grandma. So that's it's a separate one.
I think too many people break that one too often. Any other closing words, Rebecca, Layla? Doesn't look like we have questions coming in at this point.
None for me. Just thanks for the chance to share some of this with the group. And, I think people know where to find us if they have follow-up questions once they dig into the material a little bit more and into those different components of the toolkit.
Great. Allison, if you can transition our slides, I think you might have to stop share. That is exactly right. So we do have continuing access to the advisors. I think it's attached to the invites for all the webinars that we have, the list of advisors, what their areas of expertise are. Those are available to all of you. Like, this has really been, I think this series is something, again, that Rebecca emphasized in her talk today, was that like, this is about a journey. And this is something we kind of get embarked on, and then we continue to maintain and grow and evolve. You don't suddenly become mature in anything. It's a process and a journey, and things keep evolving around us. So there's always something new to learn and develop. So that's what this webinar series has really been about, is giving you a very high level skim of a lot of information at a very macro level, with the idea and the hope that you can take some of that information and apply that to you where you're at. And you're not alone in doing that. We do have the series of advisors that are here to work with you on this. This is not easy work. The biggest organizations in the world struggle with all of this, and your governments have a huge amount of responsibility, but we're here with these tools and resources. Hopefully they get you started in whatever it is that your priority is in all of the things we've talked about. So again, thanks everybody for joining the series, and I wish you all the best. And I'm sure, and I'm hopeful we will connect again as you start to process and use this information in your government context.